The 6 psychological phases a narcissist often experiences after losing someone are far more complex than they first appear. Curious. Before we dive in, it's important to understand what I mean by the word phases. It doesn't describe a clean, step-by-step journey where one stage ends before the next begins. Narcissistic psychology rarely works in such a predictable way. Instead, think of these phases as recurring internal psychological states. They may unfold within days, stretch across months, overlap with one another, or repeat unexpectedly. From the outside, the behavior may seem confusing or completely irrational, yet beneath it lies a consistent psychological pattern that becomes much easier to recognize once you understand the forces driving it. That deeper psychological process is exactly what this episode from NarcAlert is here to uncover. Most discussions about narcissists losing someone stay focused on what people can see. They explain the obvious behaviors, hoovering attempts, revenge tactics, smear campaigns, or quickly finding a replacement partner. While those actions are important, they are only symptoms. The real story exists underneath those behaviors, inside the fragile psychological structure that creates them. Once you understand that internal framework, the narcissist's reactions become far less mysterious and far more revealing. By the end of this episode, you'll have a much clearer understanding of why these reactions unfold the way they do. The first psychological phase surprises almost everyone because it rarely matches what people expect. Most assume the narcissist will immediately explode with anger, seek revenge, spread lies, or rush into another relationship. Although those responses can certainly happen, they usually aren't the first thing that appears. The initial response is often something that resembles complete emotional detachment. From the outside, the narcissist appears calm, collected, and almost strangely unaffected. They continue posting casually on social media as though nothing significant has happened. Conversations with mutual friends sound relaxed and controlled. There are no obvious signs of heartbreak or emotional collapse. Everything about their behavior suggests they have moved on effortlessly. For the person who walked away, witnessing this apparent composure can be deeply painful. It often reinforces every insecurity they carried throughout the relationship. They begin wondering if they ever truly mattered, if the relationship was genuine, or if they were simply replaceable all along. But the reality beneath that appearance tells a very different story. What looks like emotional stability is actually a powerful psychological defense mechanism. What seems like indifference is not the absence of emotion at all. Instead, you're witnessing the narcissist's protective system working at maximum intensity because it has encountered a threat it cannot comfortably process. That defense is known as devaluation. At this early point, the devaluation isn't primarily directed toward you. Instead, it targets the meaning of the loss itself. Rather than emotionally processing the end of the relationship, the narcissist unconsciously begins rewriting the story in a way that minimizes its importance. Inside their mind, the relationship becomes less meaningful, less valuable, and less emotionally significant than it truly was. Your importance gradually shrinks within this revised narrative because acknowledging your real value would require confronting emotions that feel overwhelming and psychologically unbearable. This reconstruction isn't usually a deliberate performance. The narcissist isn't consciously deciding to appear unaffected in order to manipulate others, although that may happen later. During this first phase, the response is largely automatic. Their mind instinctively protects itself from emotional devastation by reducing the emotional weight of what has just been lost. It's similar to an internal psychological immune system doing everything possible to prevent a painful reality from fully entering awareness. The second phase begins once this protective narrative can no longer completely shield them from reality. Eventually, real life starts breaking through the story they created. The carefully constructed belief that the relationship wasn't truly important begins to weaken as daily life repeatedly reminds them of what is now missing. Interestingly, these reminders are rarely the obvious forms of attention or admiration they openly enjoyed. Instead, the absence becomes noticeable through the countless small experiences that quietly supported their emotional world without them ever consciously recognizing it. They begin noticing the missing laughter that once followed their jokes, the familiar way you listened when they spoke, the comfort of having someone who remembered exactly how they took their coffee, understood their personal history, recognized their emotional triggers, and instinctively knew how to approach them during difficult moods. These weren't dramatic moments, yet together they formed an intimate familiarity that quietly shaped everyday life. Over time, those countless personal details became woven into their routine so naturally that they hardly noticed their importance while you were present. Only after your absence becomes permanent do they begin realizing how much of their daily psychological comfort depended on someone who understood them in ways that cannot be instantly replaced. If you send the next portion, I'll continue the rewrite in the same style and maintain seamless flow. As those familiar routines disappear, the empty spaces they once filled become impossible to ignore. Day after day, reality exposes all the moments your presence quietly shaped, moments the narcissist's mind conveniently erased while convincing itself the relationship never truly mattered. That is when the second psychological phase begins. Stage 2 is panic. Not panic expressed openly, because genuine vulnerability is something a narcissist has spent a lifetime avoiding. Instead, it unfolds internally. Beneath the composed exterior is a growing sense of psychological instability. They begin realizing that the loss they dismissed as insignificant is creating consequences they never expected. The emotional supply they depended on is no longer available, and the gap left behind is becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. This is the point where the urge to hoover usually starts to develop, even if they don't immediately act on it. Without admitting it, even to themselves, they begin paying much closer attention to your life than their outward behavior suggests. They check your social media far more often than someone who supposedly doesn't care. They casually question mutual friends, disguising curiosity as ordinary conversation while quietly collecting information. Are you doing okay? Have you started seeing someone else? Do you seem happier? Are you struggling, or are you moving forward without them? These questions are rarely motivated by genuine love or concern. They're driven by an obsessive need to evaluate the damage. It's similar to someone repeatedly examining an injury, not to help it heal, but to determine how serious it really is. And what they often discover during this quiet monitoring pushes them directly into the third stage. Stage 3 is rage. This isn't the kind of anger most people experience after a breakup. It serves an entirely different psychological purpose. It's not grief searching for relief or heartbreak looking for an outlet. It's the eruption of a narcissistic injury, a deep wound to their identity that transforms into outward aggression. By this point, the emotional control they've been trying to maintain begins cracking. The anger becomes targeted, deliberate, and surprisingly calculated. Instead of reacting randomly, they focus on the areas where they know they can hurt you the most. Years of intimacy have given them valuable knowledge about your insecurities, private experiences, trusted relationships, and emotional vulnerabilities. During this stage, that knowledge often becomes ammunition. The smear campaign doesn't happen by accident. It is usually built with intention. They may question your credibility, damage your reputation among mutual friends, twist confidential conversations, or pull personal moments out of context until they fit a completely different narrative. The goal is to present themselves as the reasonable victim while portraying you as the source of every problem. For the people who genuinely cared about you, this stage can be especially disturbing. They're watching someone use the trust that was built inside the relationship as a weapon against the very person who offered it. The closeness you once shared is transformed into evidence for a story that never actually existed. That cruelty isn't simply a byproduct of their anger, it serves a purpose. At its core, this stage isn't mainly about punishing you. It's about reclaiming control over the story your departure created. When you left, especially if you did so calmly, confidently, and without emotional chaos, you challenged the identity the narcissist had carefully protected. Your decision suggested that perhaps they were the problem all along. Stage 3 is an attempt to erase that possibility before it becomes accepted by everyone around them. Ironically, this phase exposes more truth than the narcissist intends. Their reaction is almost always excessive. The intensity of the hostility doesn't match the situation, and even people drawn into their version of events often sense that something feels off. They may not openly question it, but they recognize the imbalance. Healthy anger reflects pain. Explosive, relentless rage usually reflects something much deeper. It reveals a person whose emotional world has been shaken far more than they are willing to admit. The intensity itself becomes evidence that they lost something meaningful, cared more deeply than they ever acknowledged, and are now trying to destroy anything that reminds them of that uncomfortable reality. In that sense, as destructive as this phase can be for those caught in its path, it is also one of the most revealing moments after the relationship ends. Hidden beneath the accusations, manipulation, and character attacks is an unspoken admission they would never willingly express. You mattered. The loss was real. And the detached confidence displayed in the beginning was never genuine emotional freedom. It was simply a defense. Eventually, however, even rage exhausts itself. When the anger begins fading, something very different takes its place. The silence that follows isn't the carefully maintained silence of the first stage. Earlier, the quiet was intentional, a psychological shield designed to avoid confronting painful emotions. The silence that comes after the storm is entirely different. This one isn't performed. It arrives because there is nothing left to distract them from the reality they have been trying to outrun. When the anger finally burns itself out, an entirely different kind of silence takes its place. This silence isn't intentional like it was in the beginning. It isn't carefully maintained or strategically performed. It's simply what remains after the emotional energy required to fuel the rage has been exhausted. There is no immediate plan, no fresh narrative to construct, no convenient distraction, and no new source of validation capable of filling the emptiness. That is where stage 4 begins. Ironically, this is the phase almost nobody recognizes from the outside because it looks completely different from what is actually happening. To everyone watching, the narcissist appears to have finally moved on. Their life seems stable again. The emotional chaos has disappeared, and they no longer seem invested in what happened. It creates the impression that they have accepted the ending and settled comfortably into a new chapter. Internally, however, something very different is taking place. Stage 4 is the closest a narcissist usually comes to experiencing genuine grief. Yet it bears little resemblance to the grief most people understand. It cannot be acknowledged, openly felt, or processed in healthy ways, because doing so would require admitting that something valuable has been lost. That admission would directly challenge the protective identity they've built, the belief that no person has the power to affect them more deeply than they choose. As a result, the grief remains buried. It has no name, no healthy outlet, and no emotional language. Instead of appearing as sadness, it quietly transforms into chronic irritation, emotional restlessness, unexplained frustration, and a lingering dissatisfaction with life that never seems to disappear. They sense something is wrong but cannot honestly identify its source because recognizing it would require a level of self-awareness their defenses continually reject. This is often the stage where a replacement relationship begins revealing its weaknesses. If someone new entered the picture earlier, they were usually chosen because they could quickly restore attention, admiration, and emotional supply. They weren't selected because of genuine compatibility or meaningful emotional connection. They filled the immediate void but not the deeper one. Over time, that difference becomes increasingly obvious. The new relationship provides validation, but it cannot recreate the familiarity, understanding, and emotional history that naturally developed over years together. Somewhere beneath their defenses, the narcissist recognizes that something significant is missing, even if they cannot consciously admit what it is. Because they cannot identify the real problem, they repeat the only pattern they know. The same devaluation that eventually damaged previous relationships begins targeting the new partner as well. Frustration builds, disappointment grows, and the person who once seemed like the perfect replacement slowly becomes another source of dissatisfaction. The cycle simply starts again. This is the repeating pattern that has quietly shaped nearly every important relationship they've experienced. But this time, one important difference exists. The memory of the person they lost continues lingering in the background. Whether that person was exceptionally empathetic, deeply understanding, or simply someone who truly saw beneath the narcissist's carefully constructed image, their absence creates an invisible comparison. Every new connection feels slightly less fulfilling. Every source of admiration feels weaker. Even maintaining the familiar performance begins requiring more effort than before. Eventually, that unresolved absence creates enough internal pressure to trigger the 5th stage. At this point, the narcissist decides they need to reconnect. The approach isn't always obvious. Sometimes they reach out indirectly through a mutual friend they've quietly stayed connected with ever since they began monitoring your life. Sometimes they leave carefully timed reactions, likes, or comments on social media that appear accidental but are actually designed to gauge your response. Other times they send a direct message written to sound emotional, spontaneous, or sincere while serving a much more calculated purpose. Every approach is essentially asking the same silent questions. Is the door still open? Can I still reach you? Has enough time passed for your boundaries to weaken? Has your certainty faded into something I can influence again? This is the hoovering impulse that first emerged during stage 2, finally turning into action. Earlier, pride and anger prevented them from reaching out. Now the unresolved grief and emotional emptiness have become stronger than their need to maintain the appearance of complete indifference. When they return, they rarely present the version of themselves that existed at the end of the relationship. Instead, they almost always recreate the person you first believed they were, the charming, attentive, emotionally available version from the beginning. That familiar image is carefully brought back because it represents the version of the relationship most likely to reopen the connection and restore the emotional supply they have been unable to replace. The 6th and final stage begins with an attempt to reclaim what was lost. By this point, the narcissist has already moved through denial, panic, rage, and the quiet emptiness that followed. The absence continues to linger, creating pressure they cannot fully explain. Eventually, that pressure pushes them toward action. They decide to reconnect. When they do, they rarely return as the person you left. Instead, they reintroduce the version of themselves that first captured your attention. The warm, attentive, charismatic individual who made you feel uniquely understood suddenly reappears. The affection returns. The attentiveness returns. The conversations feel familiar. The emotional intensity that once made the connection seem extraordinary begins showing itself again. In many cases, the love bombing that marked the beginning of the relationship quietly reactivates. What makes this stage particularly confusing is that the narcissist often appears sincere. From the outside, it can look like genuine self-reflection, personal growth, or a realization of what they lost. In reality, the situation is far more complicated. Their desire to reconnect is often real. They genuinely miss the emotional supply you provided. They genuinely feel the absence of the validation, attention, familiarity, and emotional energy that once existed between you. Because that longing is real, the vulnerability they display can seem authentic. It may not feel like an act because, in their mind, it isn't entirely one. But sincerity of desire is not the same thing as genuine change. Wanting access to something again does not automatically mean a person has developed the emotional capacity necessary to maintain it differently. The narcissist may honestly want you back while remaining fundamentally unchanged in the ways that originally damaged the relationship. This distinction is what makes stage 5 so dangerous for the person on the receiving end. The danger doesn't necessarily come from conscious manipulation. The impact exists regardless of whether the narcissist understands exactly what they are doing. What makes this stage risky is that their return naturally targets a very specific emotional space within you. It targets the gap between healing and longing. It reaches into the distance between the life you have been building and the life you once imagined with them. It touches the part of you that remembers the good moments, the promises, the connection, and the hope that existed before the relationship's destructive patterns fully revealed themselves. For many people, that gap still exists. Not because they are weak, not because they failed to heal, but because their feelings were genuine. When love is real on your side, the emotional imprint does not simply disappear because logic tells it to. Healing is rarely that simple. You can fully understand why a relationship ended and still occasionally feel the pull of what once existed. The narcissist understands this better than most people realize. Throughout the relationship, they learned your fears, hopes, emotional needs, vulnerabilities, and desires. They know which words create comfort, which memories create nostalgia, and which emotional doors remain slightly open even after considerable healing. As a result, their return often feels remarkably precise. Whether consciously or unconsciously, they aim directly at the emotional space where your growth and your unresolved feelings intersect. Their intimate knowledge of you allows them to approach with an accuracy that can feel almost impossible to resist. This is why so many people find themselves pulled back into the cycle despite knowing exactly how it ended the first time. Eventually, however, the final stage arrives, and unlike the others, it is almost invisible. From the outside, it looks like life simply continues. The narcissist moves forward, new relationships appear, new routines develop, new social circles form. They continue constructing the image of a person who has fully recovered and adapted. To anyone observing from a distance, it may seem as though they absorbed the loss and carried on without lasting consequences. At first glance, this can be incredibly painful. It can create the impression that you never truly mattered. It can make you question whether the relationship had any lasting impact at all. It can even tempt you to believe that the emotional cost existed only on your side. But stage 6 tells a different story. Stage 6 is not about healing, it is about adaptation. The narcissist does not process the loss in the way emotionally healthy individuals typically do. They do not fully examine their role in what happened. They do not integrate the experience through genuine accountability, deep self-reflection, or meaningful emotional growth. Instead, they build around it. The loss becomes part of the structure of their life without ever being fully acknowledged. Imagine constructing a building around a permanent empty space in the center. The space remains untouched, unexplored, and unnamed, yet everything built afterward must accommodate its existence. That is how many narcissists carry significant losses. They reorganize themselves around them. The impact appears in subtle ways. It influences who they pursue next. It shapes what they seek in future partners. It affects how they evaluate new relationships. It quietly alters their expectations, frustrations, and disappointments. Often they spend years searching for something they cannot clearly identify. They look for familiar feelings, familiar forms of understanding, familiar emotional experiences, without fully recognizing what they are actually searching for. This is why certain relationships leave permanent marks, even on people who caused immense damage within them. Not because the narcissist suddenly becomes healthier, not because they transform into a more emotionally mature person, but because they encountered someone who truly saw them, someone who understood them deeply, someone who loved them with a level of sincerity their psychological defenses were never designed to fully receive, yet were equally incapable of completely forgetting. That experience becomes a fixed point inside them. Everything afterward is measured against it, even if unconsciously. Future relationships may provide attention, admiration, excitement, and validation. Yet something often feels slightly less satisfying. The performance required to maintain their image becomes slightly more exhausting. The distractions lose some of their effectiveness. The quiet moments become harder to escape. And beneath all of it lies a question they can never fully confront. What would have happened if they had been capable of showing up differently? What would have happened if they had been able to sustain intimacy instead of controlling it? What would have happened if they had chosen honesty over manipulation, accountability over blame, vulnerability over self-protection? Their psychology rarely allows them to explore those questions openly, yet the questions remain. They return in fleeting moments of reflection, in disappointments that seem larger than they should be, and in relationships that never quite provide what they hoped they would. That is the true cost of losing someone who genuinely mattered. They do not fully recover from the loss. They simply learn how to organize their life around it. And there is a profound difference between moving forward and merely moving. A person who heals carries the experience, learns from it, and grows beyond it. A narcissist often continues circling the emotional consequences of what they destroyed, unable to fully approach them, and unable to completely escape them. The relationship becomes something they can never reclaim, never recreate, and never entirely stop reaching for. Not because they understand it completely, but because somewhere beneath the layers of defenses they depend on, they recognize that they lost something they were never truly equipped to value while they had it. And that recognition, however buried, remains with them long after everything else has changed.